Appreciate, again, your being here. We are going to end with a bang. Actually, we're going to end with two bangs. The second one will be for those that haven't had enough snacks or calories today. Immediately upon the conclusion of this panel, there will be a reception back in the room where we had lunch with drinks, additional snacks, and fellowship. This panel is to dispense with grumping about the status quo and get into what we might actually do differently going forward. Toward which end, we have two terrific papers by, as you can see from the program, by Paul Hill and Ken Meier. Paul sets out an actual governance alternative plan as well as criteria against which to evaluate and, in his view, criticize all other governance plans. Ken explores some of the pros and cons of governance reform and then offers some additional suggestions that overlap with but are not exactly the same as governance and structure. To comment and continue the conversation, we have Paul Pastorek, who until not very long ago was trying to repair, doing a pretty good job of it, by the way, the schools of New Orleans and Louisiana, including some pretty important governance innovations. And Jon Schnur, who has worked at multiple times at the federal government, including most recently as the Chief of Staff to Arne Duncan, but has also spent years trying to implant new leaders in what I'm going to call mostly existing schools under the current governance arrangements. So we've got a lot of experience as well as expertise on the panel. Paul Hill and Ken have 10 minutes each to get across the gist of what they most want you to know about their papers. Paul Pastorek and Jon have 7 minutes each to tell their own stories as well as their own war stories and perspectives as well as their take on the papers. So without further ado, we turn to Paul Hill. And if you'd like to stand up, I'm happy to vacate the podium.
No, I think I'll be glad to be here. This will be extremely gisty in 10 minutes. I have taken the hazardous duty of actually making a proposal in light of the kinds of critiques and concerns raised today. I might just have said this maybe turns out to be an addendum to Chris Cerf's talk earlier. Could have just yielded him my time. Basically, I've tried to think about how you'd get a system that adapted to the big needs we have today, particularly consistently low-performing schools in some areas and for some groups of children, and also was extremely innovative, that is, was looking constantly for better ways of doing instruction. And I argue in the paper and reject pretty quickly that a pure voucher plan with no kind of government oversight is not really a starter for many reasons, mainly because of the inequities that would almost certainly come about. And I have to say that nobody but Milton Friedman has ever proposed such a thing. If you read Chubb and Moe closely, they have a licensing strategy and so on that is basically an overseen hybrid voucher. I go a little farther in government oversight than they do. I do believe you need an oversight mechanism for public schools, and you need a local one, not just a state one, for two reasons. One of them because every locality is different in its mix of people and needs, and secondly because in a system where there's almost no attention to the needs in a particular locality, it's possible that some groups of children would fall through the cracks. It's my reason for not being in favor of pure vouchers or completely unrelated independent charter authorizers as the whole government mechanism. So I make a proposal that it kind of integrates two things. One of them is place-based local governance, but total family choice about schools, not only in a particular locality, but elsewhere if they want to do it online. So, and my proposal is a typically American proposal. If I can have those slides up. My proposal is a typically American proposal. It has constitutional, there we are. It has constitutional constraints on government and uses separation of powers, and I'll try to explain how that happens. I start at the local level. I'll explain more briefly about other levels, but let's start at the local level. A governance system at the local level should do certain things. I think it needs to be legitimate, meaning voters have to have a say in what happens, but you have to have a system where schools are not over-regulated and the professionals in the schools both have freedom of action and are accountable for the results. Families have to have good options, and that means all families. It has to pay attention to the failures of some schools in some localities and keep finding options for those children. In particular, it has to be based on continuous improvement. There are don'ts on the other side. And I won't really elaborate those, but the don't I'm most concerned about in trying to design this is the don't of allowing continual low performance in schools dealing with the most needy children. So there are several design principles here. I won't run through all of them, but basically the idea is that a locally elected board is a board with only one real or only two real powers. It can decide what the mix of schools operated in its community will be and decide whether to start them by old mechanisms or by chartering or by contracting. It can also decide who the chief executive officer will be. It would not hire anybody except the chief executive officer. It would have no employees, but it would only exercise this one power. And I'm inspired by Harry Truman's dictum: the House of Representatives has only one power, the power of the person. That's enough. I'd argue that for a school board, the power to say what schools will operate in this community and the ability to make real judgments about that based on performance is enough. So the chief executive would be hired by the school board but have a lot of independence. The idea would be schools could be run in many ways. An existing district could continue schools run in the old way, but any school could be subject to review and closure at any time, so that over time schools would get into something like de facto charter status because they would all be contingent. And there'd be a real effort to create a level playing field in terms of funding on a per pupil basis, almost all of it going to the schools. The one function of the chief executive officer, besides recommending what schools to close, what schools to start, would be public information. I can talk, but I won't elaborate now, arrangements I have in mind for building a special education system where all the schools have, in a sense, something like health insurance that lets them be sure they can fund special education when it's needed, and then the providers of special education are actually a marketplace of independent providers. So the system attracts the best talent it can get any place it can get it, and its main job, two main jobs. One is continuous improvement. Let's make the best better, but secondly, and most important, let's make sure that children in the schools that are the lowest performing have new options. They're the big problem, the big dedication of the district. There's a hokey diagram. It just says that voters elect the school board. The school board decides what schools are allowed to be open and not open in the locality. The CEO recommends that and oversees the schools in a method quite like charter authorizing. I said this is a kind of a constitutional concept. The board has particular powers and no other powers. And basically, the board is not allowed, for example, to keep operating low-performing schools over a very long time. And here's where another part of the conception comes in. The state retains an authority similar to that of the Recovery School District in Louisiana to seize control of and recharter low-performing schools. So a school board does not have a guaranteed exclusive in its own locality. The state authority can seize control of the schools and charter them out and supervise them. It can also let them join some other district if they want to be supervised by some locality other than their own. I just said this about the Recovery School District. The point is that when schools are seized from a locality because of low performance, they're returned to the locality only after they've come up to high performance and only if they want to go back. What I haven't said is the assumption that schools, not the district, will be the employers of teachers. It will be the business of the CEO to watch the quality of recruits into the local schools and ask whether the district as a whole is being a competitive employer, whether we need to try harder to attract better people into our locality, but the district will not be the employer. Dollars will flow to schools, and I made some different proposals. I'm Mitt Romney on this, flip-flop daily about what proportion should be kept into the central office, but very little, only to perform central functions. Certainly the CEO will discover the needs for certain capacities in the locality. For example, new special education services, a better teacher recruiting mechanism, and these can be incubated in the central office, but they must be spun off into independent organizations in 5 years. So the point is that the central office will not grow by accretion. Schools basically have the money and purchase services from independent sources, whether that's mix and matching whatever they want, or joining a charter management organization or some other independent organization that provides comprehensive services to schools. That's up to them. And the consequence of making a good choice on the part of the school is the potential of failing academically and losing your charter or your license to operate. I've also talked in the paper about trying to detach the school district from functions that have been extremely burdensome and harmful to school districts that have stopped innovation. And one of them is the ownership of buildings. And I propose that buildings all become the property of an independent trust that can do anything they want with the buildings, including selling them, and schools can pay rent, so that all the capital money will go into the schools per pupil expenditure, undifferentiated. They don't have to use it for capital. And then at a later time, if people really want to know more about this, I'll talk a bit more about the health insurance concept for special education, but that may be for another day.
Thank you very much. Take it away, Ken.
All right, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here today. Where am I? Okay. It's supposed to go up. I would normally start out by defining governance reform and talk about what the system is, but everybody else has done that, so let's go to slide 2. We've looked at a lot of reforms today. Most of the reforms that we've looked at today have created a little bit more control by generalist politicians or more general units, mayors, governors, etc. There's been a lot of talk about the use of markets or market-like mechanisms, vouchers, charters, performance incentives. We have not talked about nationalizing the system, and I won't because I don't think that's feasible. We've not talked about more radical decentralization because I think the consensus was that's part of the problem that we're dealing with. Governance reform I always think of as the holy grail because it might be the solution to Elmore's paradox, which if I paraphrase, almost everything in education works with 30 students, nothing works with 30,000 students. And so how do you get a reform to scale? For a governance reform to work, they have to do one of 3 things. They have to change what's being taught in the classroom, and that's always the first question to ask. Or second, they have to change who is doing the teaching in the classroom and the quality of that teaching. They might do either of these by changing who's responsible for education, and that's the question that has to be traced out and that logic for how that will happen. But what governance structures do, and I think we've had plenty of evidence here, is they lock in values. They lock in biases, and those biases stay in the system and generate results. And the idea behind governance reform is to see if we can lock in a different set of values that will produce some results that will be more amenable to the sort of things we want. This paper takes a set of theoretical lenses and looks at governance reform in 5 different ways, and I'm not going to talk about each of those, just to let you know that I look at it as a structural problem. I look at it as an oversight problem, which I think is probably the most severe problem, a political problem, as a network management problem, and as an incentives problem. The objective of the paper was to essentially ask the following. Of all these reforms, what do the data show? And you've already heard today the data show not much in either direction, or sometimes everything in each direction. And second, what's the logic? That is, what are the values that are being embedded and how do they play out and how do they end up doing some things in the classroom? The paper stresses a lot of examples from Texas, and quite frankly, that's because that's what I know. I also recognize that Texas is a very strange state educational system. It is an educational system that vests far more discretion in the districts and far more discretion in the schools than exists in a lot of other states. Paper performance is an ongoing issue, which is actually in effect. The principals are paid radically different amounts depending on their performance, and almost every superintendent in the state has a performance clause in their contract, and they have a lot of discretion in terms of adjusting a school. As an illustration, to deal with the Sam Houston High School issue in Houston, Texas, 2 years in a row, rated unacceptable. A new principal was brought in. She brought in 140 new teachers and simply changed that system around. When you have that sort of discretion, things can happen. The paper also stresses a lot of work on charters because as I look at these reforms, I think charters are the feasible option in terms of politics. That camel's nose is already in the tent, it can be expanded, and there are interesting things going on there. I also want to always stress that I actually like to focus on the bottom end of education. The means or whatever here is an interesting discussion, but the real problems I think in the U.S. are on the bottom end of this education. There are clear failures. The paper talks about several of those clear failures. The logic I've used to review is to always ask a very simple question. Is it the case that governance system B outperforms governance system A? Or is it actually the case that governance system B, along with something else, C, outperforms system A? That is it the fact that mayor control is better than an independent school district, or is it the fact that mayor control sometimes generates a talented manager and leader with some initiative and authority? And if that's the case, maybe what we should be focusing on is C, a talented leadership and authority, or whatever the key causal variable is in this process. I think the most serious problem we have is our oversight problem. We do not shut down failures. We don't shut down public schools that fail. We don't shut down charter schools that fail. I'm looking forward to the New Jersey experiment because I will be there collecting data the minute that happens. I'm currently analyzing data on 63 programs and schools or districts in Texas that are under receivership, and I can tell you the preliminary results is state takeovers don't affect the downward trend of those schools or districts at all. Political control, which is the expansion of political control, I think has a fairly ambiguous outcomes. It may be better than the alternatives, but quite frankly, coming from a state that has as its governor Rick Perry, and then when we can contrast that him with Mark White, who started those reforms, there's a heck of a lot of difference that plays out when you move control to political officials and they switch around. I think problems of incentives need to be seriously addressed. The incentives go to who is teaching, and we've got plenty of evidence today that cross-nationally, incentives to go into teaching vary dramatically. Some of them are monetary, some of them are status. We need incentives to weed out failures, and I think we need some incentives to actually lead these types of reforms and to manage these types of problems. I'd also like to put a slightly different issue on the table. I've spent 12 years studying the management of public schools, not policy, not structure, but the management, mostly dealing with Texas, and we find that 20% of the district-to-district variation can be attributed to actions taken by the superintendent. If you could add that 20% to the bad districts, you'd have a pretty fine educational system. But so what? I think what we have here is the following. The empirical evidence and the logic implies there's really no magic bullet. In fact, I would caution against certain things. I think it's fine to eliminate bureaucracy. I also think it's not fine to eliminate capacity. I think schools work wonderfully well until bad things happen. And as an example, you might take a look at the work I've done on how Texas responded to the 50,000 students from Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, and the fact that only in those districts with management capacity, central office bureaucracy, could they take those students and not have it affect their performance. At the same time, the current state of affairs is clearly bad policy. It's unacceptable. I think that means we have to figure out how to piece reforms together in combinations that deal with both the structure and deal with the people involved. I think it's also worth examining the entire system of education to see other things that influence the inputs and the outputs. And I figured that if other people could make some outrageous proposals, I should be able to too. I have three that I want to mention. One which I don't know will be very controversial because Steve Wilson talked about it today. We need to define a minimum level of accountability in a system for charter schools. What's the minimum amount of accountability we want in terms of transparency, performance, etc. And then we need to explain to some people why those same standards shouldn't apply to public schools. Second, I think the solution on charter schools is to force charter schools to get into self-regulation. Nobody else has the willingness to improve the bad charter schools except the good charter schools. Public schools are perfectly happy to have bad charter schools. It allows them to point in that direction, and it allows them to dump some of their problem parents in those directions. The solution, charters need to fix themselves. Third, I think we need to deal with increasing the supply of educators, and I would recommend people look at one Texas reform, abolishing the education degree, and I don't think it's done any harm, and a second, which is to take advantage of a very talented crop of people that we have sort of taken advantage of in Texas, which is we really need a DREAM Act to keep first-generation kids or illegals in a place such as education. And we've got some pretty strong data in Texas that shows the wave of immigrants are among our best teachers that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. So, Paul Pastorek, what did you learn in Louisiana other than exporting kids to Texas?
It works better when you export them. Your numbers improve. So I would argue that there is a silver bullet. The silver bullet is coherence. The incoherence of the governance system in the United States is staggering. And what has us all messed up is this incoherence. And what needs to be done is that we create some coherence. And we need to start with what it is we want schools to look like and what we think will actually make a difference in schools for the outcomes for kids. But you see, we start with this very question and we can't even agree on what the answer to that is. We can't agree on what schools should look like. We can't agree on what the outcomes are that we're going to measure schools. If you can't agree on that, then how in the heck do you have this conversation? Now, you get some coherence in what it is you want schools to look like and what you believe good schools do look like and how to encourage that, and then you get everybody to follow on that pathway, and you might actually get world-class education in my lifetime. So, in Louisiana, not being an educator, being a lawyer, I'm extremely dangerous, and I am deemed to be, was deemed to be dangerous, but now that I'm out of the state, I've moved to Virginia, people are happy to have me gone. But what did we learn in 5 years of my tenure, which is almost all of the period post-Katrina? Well, if you identify what kind of schools actually drive good student outcomes, and you try to create an environment which is coherent and supports that, you will get significant improvement. So what New Orleans shows after 5 years is, with about 30,000 kids, is significant improvement, growth in academic achievement with kids that far outdistances by orders of magnitude the growth in the state overall. Graduations that are rapidly climbing. Now, I will say that, and I will say that we're dealing with the most difficult kids, generally speaking, and I will also say that even after this growth, which academic achievement has doubled over the 5 years that we've been in this post-Katrina environment, the doubling of growth has only moved us from 25% of kids being able to be proficient to 50% of kids being able to be proficient. So we obviously have a long way to go, and I don't want to say New Orleans is the answer, but I think it shows us a number of possible lessons. So what are those? What is the environment that we try to create in New Orleans for the last 5 years and that we're really honing in on and trying to prove? Number one, a competitive environment for schools to operate in. Schools must compete with each other for the privilege of educating kids. And they compete at a number of different levels. They compete against each other on what their overall outcomes are. They compete for children because money's followed the child, and kids do not have to go next door to the school building. They can go all the way across town if they want. It is a highly mobile environment where kids can march with their feet. Principal-led schools. Get the administrators to stop telling the principals what to do, when to do it, how to do it, operating all off the same script and being on page 79 by day 7. Now, everybody tells you you have to do that because of the high degree of mobility in urban environments. It's BS, in my opinion, because we haven't been doing that. We have 80% of schools in New Orleans that are charter schools. And they're not all on the same page. And we have high mobility, and we're still doing significantly better than the average bear. There's clear expectations of growth and what we expect schools to do. And when they don't achieve that, they go out of business. And it doesn't matter whether you're a charter school or you're a regular school. Everybody lives by the same rules. Everybody lives by the same funding. Everybody can apply the charter school rules to the non-charter schools and vice versa. It all works together. There's adequate insight and oversight by both the district leadership team and by the state. There has to be, you cannot have pure market yet. We're not ready for it, I don't think, because there are many, many kids who do not know how to march to the other school with their own feet and can't deal with the discrepancies that occur in their environment. And then finally, I think you have to have the ability to radically restructure what's going on in the district. So the Recovery School District has the ability to put schools out of business. And I think we need to focus on the schools at the low end of the spectrum, but we need to focus on schools at all ends of the spectrum. So what we say in New Orleans is, every year out of 90 schools, 4 schools will go out of business if they're at the bottom of the barrel, whether they met expectations or not. They go out of business. So if every year 4 schools go out of business, the management team goes out of business, a new management team is brought in, and we actually prepare and ready a new management team to come in like was done in Charlotte, North Carolina. If you do that, you're going to put higher quality schools in place, and you're going to drive everybody to go to a higher standard. Now, that's all been done by a state agency. There's a big mistake I think we make in governance, and that is saying who is in charge is governance. Who is in charge is not governance. How you govern is governance. So many states have failed on takeovers, many states, because all they do is rearrange deck chairs on the Titanic. They take the old superintendent out and they put the new superintendent in, and somehow the new superintendent is going to work in an incoherent system and succeed. It will not happen. The theory in New Orleans is we will not run the schools by the state, we will charter them, and next year all schools will be chartered in the city of New Orleans. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Take it away, John.
So let me make a few observations and comments from kind of given my experience, partly involved in federal policy and partly worked with several hundred leaders around the country at the school level to look at kind of what the implications are of the context they're in for performance. And I'll preface this by saying each of the people on this panel and many in the room have a lot better answers than I do about what governance should look like. But I do have some questions and some issues that I think should be addressed as this really important endeavor moves forward. First point, good governance matters hugely, and I think that people are here because of that. But I just want to say there's an incredible gap between the importance of the focus on good governance versus the lack of attention that it's really had in discussions on American education. Now, I know that's a basic assumption of why we're here today, but it is extraordinary to me how when we've looked at the highest performing, fastest improving schools and school systems around the country in my work and our work, the ones that sustain good performance over time in one form or another have excellent governance, or at least good governance. That takes different shapes. And where we see successes in a context with inadequate governance, they don't sustain themselves, and the people leave and performance doesn't sustain. And yet, this has been a subject which has received enormously, shockingly scant attention. So I just want this focus today and finding ways to actually move in an action-oriented way on this, I think is of great importance to American education. Second point, I think there are two big tensions, maybe dilemmas to consider that I see as this work moves forward that I don't know how to resolve. I might call the first one of these Winston Churchill versus Paul Pastorek. And let me explain. In two different contexts. I think it was Churchill who said, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong, my old history teachers will have my hide, but I think that democracy, I think, is the worst form of governance in the world, except for everything else. And now in a public, in the context of government of a country, our country's based on, and Churchill observed it, the insight that while there are a lot of other forms of governance that could drive better outcomes, in the end, because of human failings, that the notion of our democracy with all the checks and balance that limit the power of government in different ways actually is better than all the alternatives, as slow and cumbersome that leaves our government being, including today. I think I, for one, am very frustrated that our government is not moving forward, but partly this was a constitutional design, as people here know, to give checks and balances to make sure that no one part of government could actually drive and have the power. And I think that in the context of a democracy where the purpose was especially to avoid the abuse of liberty and to have certain basic constitutional rights protected, in my view, there's some sense to that. Then you take Paul Pastorek, who I agree with on so many issues, or Chris Cerf at his luncheon discussion, and essentially part of what their argument is in a governance system for education, as opposed to for the country, one of the key principles is how do you drive coherence and how do you drive improvement? So instead of the purpose being protecting individuals from government and any one branch of government from having too much power, given our dangerously flat outcomes in this country compared to where they need to go, the principles I'm hearing is how do you actually drive coherence and improvement through governance? There's a tension there, because the more you drive governance in some ways, sort of to drive coherence and improvement, the riskier it is and the more at odds it is in some ways with our form of democratic governance. And so I just think that knowing that there's nothing more important to our country than much better outcomes for education, how you resolve that tension I think is a big issue that should be addressed here. Second big tension that I see is around the dependency of good governance on excellent leadership and the importance of, as the panelists were saying, supporting good leadership. In all the instances where I've seen good governance succeed, there's been extraordinary leadership. And I think wherever I see education work, it's because great local leaders, pretty close to the ground, whether school level, city level, state level, are empowered to drive things. and governance systems that empower them to do that, I think are producing the most remarkable outcomes we see in the country when leaders have ownership and investment in what's happening at the local level. And yet, on the other hand, I believe in that deeply. That's one of my core principles for our work. On the other hand, we know we have uneven leadership and inadequate leadership. And it's the question to me of how you design governance in a way that actually can support and empower excellent leadership with ownership and ensure that there's a governance where there's a system where there's corrections for that and the inevitable mediocrity of leadership, I think is a real tension that needs to be considered. Two last points, just to keep within my time. One is, given, I think, the discussion today and the theoretical grounding here, but the gap between theory and practice, and given, I think, some of these questions, I think the most sort of urgent priority is to find some places, some cities and states with good leadership that are willing in a sort of careful way to try out. Louisiana is an example of a state that already has, but to have some more rigorous experimentation with different kinds of governance in different cities and states, and take some of the theoretical ideas and try them out and see. Because I think there's any one solution we come up with right now is not likely to be the answer, and I think the idea of having some R&D in this kind of laboratories of democracy context in the country would be an excellent idea. It would take a lot of work to make that happen, but I think it's very important. The next point I'd make is, while we're doing this, and if we can get into the Q&A or panel discussion, I'd be happy to get into this more. I think there's some very pragmatic questions about what are the implications of the governance discussion for state governance and for the role of the federal government that need to be addressed. And at the state level, I think it's just a clear fact that the power of the states is increasing significantly. And I think there's power individually and states collaborating in things like the Common Core of Standards and Assessments. I think having charting some smart courses there to have some theoretical work and some practical work on how to maximize the increasingly powerful state role as an individual state and as a collection of states driving national policy, I think is in order. There's some very good work being done, but I think that's a real question that ought to be tackled in this work. And then lastly, on the federal side, some big debates, I think, should be had, and discussions about what is the appropriate role for the federal government in all of this in the U.S. context. And I guess I would argue in my last 30 seconds that it should focus on four things. One is, I think the federal government should focus robustly on ensuring that there is real transparency around how kids are doing in understandable ways toward goals that are agreed on, so that the public can understand how kids are doing across the country, because no matter what system of governance, we can't really empower the public without that kind of transparency. Secondly, I think the role of the federal government is to give incentives. At R&D, I think is an important role the federal government plays in this laboratory of democracy. Third is equity, both in terms of civil rights protections and funding. People who call for the elimination of the federal role would immediately dramatically widen the inequities of funding in this country, when we actually have some of the widest inequities of funding in the country. And fourth and lastly, some to be hotly debated principle of driving some version of state accountability and correction for low performance, and with the federal government making sure there's some set of principles that are adhered to, with some big debate about what that looks like.
Okay, thank you all. You just left us on the brink of an NCLB reauthorization discussion, John. This being Washington, it's hard to avoid ending up there at some point in the conversation. But let me defer that at least for a few minutes and try to at least get some clarity on a couple of things which I'm not sure I understand. Paul Hill, your alternative system is still largely geographically and locally based, is it not?
Yes, parents would have choices regardless of locality, and they could choose hybrid or cyber schools, but there would be a school board responsible for the mix of schools in a locality. And
the state would or wouldn't be in charge of the money? I wasn't clear from your paper on that.
Maybe I was just adopting another paper by reference. The state would be responsible for a pupil-based funding system, so that every child would carry money from the state to the school in a backpack form. In my, given that I can imagine whatever I like, I imagine the state requires that locally raised money goes the same way.
That locally raised money goes the same way. Okay. How is this different from a high-quality charter operation with a good authorizer, save for the fact that your local board is elected?
Well, that's one, and the other is the expectation that, in effect, it is an elected charter authorizer that has a little more authority because it could decide to sustain schools run by some other model, even adopting schools that were operating under the current district model, leaving them alone as long as they were able to operate with the kind of funding basis that was new. But the functions of the board are quite like that of a charter authorizer.
Okay, thank you. Ken, you trot out in the second half of your paper these 8 sort of additional reform ideas, which are not governance per se, though some of them overlap with governance. And some of them are exceedingly ambitious, like immigration law reform, for example. You weren't in these alternatives suggesting that they are more realistic or easier to get to, were you? Just that they might be equally effective?
Yeah, I don't think immigration reform is going to be easy. Even living in Texas, where it should be obvious to us, it is. But indeed, what I'm trying to stress here is there are lots of inputs coming in a variety of ways into schools. And there are ways to manipulate those inputs and those processes that aren't traditionally part of the education system. And one of those is trying to expand the number and the quality of instructors that you have.
Okay, that helps. Paul Pastorek, I need you to say a little bit more about what you mean when you use the word coherence, which you used a few times, but then you swiftly launched into a discussion of schools being different from each other and people having choices among them. So I'm inferring that by coherence you did not mean uniformity of schools, of school offerings.
That's correct. By coherence, there has to be at some high level an expectation of what will work and what will not work and agreement on that, and then there has to be the creation of an environment that will permit that to succeed. That if we can agree on those kinds of things, then we can begin to agree on what the system of governance needs to look like. So if, for example, we say that we believe that a coherent system would require a competitive environment, then people necessarily will be competing against each other, and they will be doing it in different ways. They'll be achieving the outcomes. They'll be implementing school. They'll be delivering lessons. They'll be training their teachers. They'll be hiring their teachers in different ways. But they're all competing, and they'll be arriving at an outcome that we all agree on.
Okay. Let me take you back to Louisiana for a minute. I know that besides you having spent quite a lot of time in Louisiana, I believe John spent some time there. I know Paul's acquainted Paul Hill's acquainted with Louisiana, and Ken may be too. After all, it's an adjoining state. The Louisiana governance reforms are fascinating and bold, but they're also extremely complicated and uneven. You've got the RSD, but it has at least 2 different kinds of schools. You've got statewide 5 different kinds of charters. You've got a residual New Orleans school system, which has both charters and district-operated schools. The Recovery School District has charters and district-operated schools with, I gather, different performance records. You wouldn't call this coherent, would you?
No, I wouldn't call it coherent. Not the system itself. No, I would agree with that. In fact, I think that's what makes this really an even more difficult problem, is that we're trying to create coherence in a system that we can't change immediately, and you've got to live within that system. So, for example, when we took over schools in New Orleans right after the storm, the decision was made, right or wrong, that we couldn't take over all of the schools, because if we did, we would run into Voting Rights Act violations. So we couldn't really clear the entire deck, so we would clear part of the deck. And so by taking most of the schools, but not all of them, we avoided that legal problem. But at the end of the day, we ended up with a much more complicated system. The charter school law originally was written with one type of charter school, but over time, we needed to respond to different kinds of circumstances. So we created 5 types of charter schools. Actually, it's not necessary to have, but we still haven't cleaned that up. So, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that one of the biggest challenges here, go back to 14,500 school districts in the United States, which are a product of 50 different states, how all of that will be brought together coherently while they're all continuing to behave in the way they've always behaved is going to be extremely complicated. Because while I would argue you need to blow the whole damn thing up, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But it did happen in Louisiana, and it's proven to be better. So I go around the country and say, hey, why don't you just blow it up and start over again? You might be able to get there faster.
Yeah. Incidentally, the last time I used similar terminology, I was accused of wanting to dynamite schools with children in them.
That was you.
But you and I are different.
I know. You'd wait till the kids leave before you'd set off the explosives. Paul Hill, your model has a version of a recovery school district in it, and I want to, and as a kind of place to go if the local operation screws up.
Right.
Does everybody up here think that something like an RSD is an important part of governance reform? Some entity other than the district that has the capacity to remove schools from the district and make them operate on a different basis?
May I say one thing to persuade them
Please.
further before they answer?
Go ahead.
So in the plan, there is an element that weakens teacher unions because they would be building school or CMO level unions, not district-wide, given that the district would not be the employer of the teachers. And I think that's a remedy to one form of capture, but there's another form of capture that's very dangerous, which is capture by providers. If you ended up having a bunch of nonprofit or for-profit school providers that operated all the schools in the district, they could easily exercise too much influence, and Jeff Hennig's been articulate about this in the past. The idea of the RSD is an external force that limits the ability of the local providers to capture the board such that they become indulgent toward the providers. So it does kind of break down the local monopoly.
Ken, do you think that this is a promising idea, the ability of some other entity to extricate troubled or failed schools from failed authorities?
Well, I think right now we don't have such an entity. And I think that's one of the problems, is that state departments of education don't have this capacity.
Yeah.
They don't have the capacity to go in and turn around a district or a school. They often don't have the political will, and I think that, in fact, one would need to build that capacity. The controversial part about building capacity, though, is you're building capacity for that rather than capacity for education. And people will fight always about, shouldn't we be spending this on teachers rather than oversight? But in point of fact, I don't think without this type of entity, we'll close schools or districts in any large numbers.
That we won't, unless there's an entity
Right.
that can pull that trigger,
Right.
basically, which is not the district itself.
That's correct.
So, Paul, what enabled this goes to sort of a large question for the whole panel, and then we'll get to John. What enabled the RSD to actually happen? It actually happened, if memory serves, before the hurricane. I think there's a widespread misapprehension that this was a direct result of Katrina, but it was there already, wasn't it?
It was. It was actually created about 3 years before the hurricane. We had an accountability system that said if you have consistent years of low performance, you have to restructure your school. At the time, the words were reconstitute. Remember the old reconstitute schools business? Well, the problem is that the districts had no idea what reconstitution meant, neither did the state, by the way. But what the state decided to do back in 2003 was to say the state would have the ability to reconstitute schools, and it determined that the way it would exercise reconstitution would be by chartering the school, which eliminates, not completely, I would not pretend to say it eliminates completely, but it reduces the necessity for in-house capacity of the State Department of Education, because you're not saying the State Department is going to come in and reconstitute, teach, train, hire, pay for, etc. But what we've learned is, and in the original theory in Louisiana was, back in 2003, that the entirety of reconstitution by the state through the Recovery School District would be done by charter. The problem was, after the storm, we thought that the number of schools would ramp up slowly because they were still back in Texas being educated, but they came quickly back because they didn't like Texas that much.
They knew there was a drought coming.
No, in all seriousness, the kids came back faster, so the state ended up in this really interesting problem where they could not provide enough high-quality charter schools to meet the demands, so they had to go back into the business of being a traditional district school and at the same time charter. So what has happened over time is we've weaned ourselves away from the traditional district school, the traditional superintendent, and that's why I say with exclamation point, and next year all schools will be charter schools, which then once again reduces the necessity for great capacity. The one caveat I'd put in, just having charter schools unchecked and unmanaged is not going to work either. So I don't want to say that original theory is not ultimately proving out in practice. You have to have an insight and oversight capacity. It's much smaller than a district, much smaller, but you have to have that or you can't make this work.
Did you read the bit in Ken's paper in which he in effect suggested self-regulation by the charter sector?
Yeah.
And did you buy it?
I don't buy it. You know, there are some great examples of the charter sector wanting to get rid of schools in New Orleans. There's some in California. We just had a charter that gave up its charter earlier this week. It was one of the highly touted charters, but it's been in the tank. It's a high school charter, and the charter community got them to agree to give up the charter. The problem is there are some out there who are just not responsive to the voluntary process. So at the end of the day, it does tend to work, but it doesn't completely work. So when you have real difficult problems and real hard-headed leaders of schools that are performing at low levels, and they're there to run, to create an economic environment for the betterment of the people who run the school, the charter school community will not be able to take them out of business.
Do you want to, John, 1 second. Ken, do you want to say a word about the self-regulation concept?
Yeah, let me add, because the additional part of that proposal was to actually tie funding coming into having that accreditation by the private organization, which would mean that if you didn't have that accreditation, the funding wouldn't come. So there would be a hammer there. We do have other cases of self-regulation working. As I said when I made the argument, I didn't see anybody else that really had the incentives to make charters work, because the authorizers are often cheerleaders rather than regulators. And the public schools have real mixed feelings about charters and whether they work or not. You can find lots of school superintendents who will tell you confidentially, boy, are they happy to have charters, because it allows them to dump some problems. And it also allows them to point to some schools that don't work particularly well. And there are a bunch of them that don't work particularly well. And so I think there's a hammer there. It's not unlike the hammer that the RSD has, which is somebody's got to be there at some point to pull the trigger, because if there's not a hammer behind it, I agree it's not going to work.
I agree with that.
So, John, that's sort of a two-part question. The first harkens back to my prior question, which is, do you think every place needs something like an RSD? And then the second part is, you suggested that some place ought to try governance reform. If we think about, let's say, think about New Orleans or Louisiana as kind of the 1.0 version of governance reform. What does the 2.0 version look like? And more importantly, to really put you on the spot, where should it be?
So on the first, I I do think we got suggestions coming from the panel about where. So Dallas has been nominated.
We could have a raffle.
Exactly. On the RSD question, I think that the concept of an RSD, where there's capacity to execute it well, is really important. So when I do it everywhere, I wouldn't do it everywhere. So for example, this is an example where you're not suggesting this, but the federal government would say, this is a good idea, let's mandate every state have an RSD. It would be a classic example saying, let's have a good idea and through a mandate actually make it not work. I think there's only certain places where there's the capacity to make something like that work. But where there's the capacity, one reason I think it's a very important reform is because it is one way of responding to the second dilemma, the dilemma I mentioned earlier, which is you've got this context in education where you have some incredible leadership that needs to just be empowered, in some places where you just need intervention. And I think there does need to be some checks and balances between different kinds of governance systems. So I think the idea of having charter schools that can empower excellent leaders and organizations to really create results that really haven't been created before is very important, just as it's important where a school district isn't performing for state people to come in and check it and say, you know what, we're actually going to take this over. So I think that model is really a great way of showing there isn't one system or one entity by itself that should drive things, and I think that's a great example of the resolution of that dilemma. Secondly, 2.0, let me, just in the interest of time, go right to your third question of where. And there have been other governance reforms. I mean, the mayoral control efforts in New York City, in Boston, and in D.C. and Chicago have all been important in different ways. But I think in terms of where, I think the criteria I would suggest for that is like where there is really strong political leadership and educational leadership, where there's reason to think that that's going to be there for some period of time. And we can talk about where that is, but I think that the only way that a 2.0 version is going to work is where you've got, and civic leadership, a set of political leaders, civic leaders, and education leaders who really have a high level of capacity are going to be at it for a long period of time. And I actually would say right now, if you look at a high bar on that, there aren't that many places in the country that have those.
Yeah, the long period of time part is particularly problematic, isn't it? I mean, we're already talking about New York after Bloomberg. We're experiencing D.C. after Fenty. We're experiencing Chicago after Daley.
I just mean early. I guess what I would say is there was a McKinsey report that maybe you've read, which looked at some of the criteria of some of the high-performing systems around the world. And one of the things I think that was notable about that is that all the key reforms happened typically at the beginning of a sort of tenure of leadership, where a new elected official was coming in, or a new and I think that while this is a democracy, so it's not going to be forever. But I think the idea where somebody's coming in for early in a term and there's reason to think that they're going to be there for a while. I mean, there's no magic formula here, but I think that kind of high-capacity person who you can reasonably expect will be there for a while early in their term, making this a big priority, would be a criteria I'd look at.
Okay. Go ahead, Paul Pastorek.
I was just going to say, to me, the likely places where it is going to happen, because people are moving in this direction, is Tennessee, New Jersey, and I think the interesting one is going to be Detroit, but I'm not sure that they understand exactly the model that they're trying to copy, but we'll see.
So,
Go ahead, Paul.
Just the RSD element, I agree totally with Paul and about where that's happening, but there are other localities that are moving toward the district concept of more a regulator and a regulator, a creative competition than a central operator of schools, moving at different paces. But certainly that's what Rahm Emanuel and Brizard are talking about in Chicago. Whether they get there, how far, don't know. In Denver, Boasberg is steadily increasing this. In many ways, the trials may not come about in any kind of neat, a priori, 100% way, but over time incrementally. And there, I think I could give you 10 districts that could get there. And one, even in New York, which may have slowed down, it has slowed down, it's now possible that at least one Democratic candidate for mayor will support the Bloomberg-Klein reforms, which was not possible a year ago. And if they get a pro-reform mayor, that'll keep going.
So you've been on the advocating what you at least used to call a portfolio approach to school system management for a long time. I wanted to ask you, have you seen any take-up on that idea anywhere?
I see the most unsatisfying kind of take-up. The adoption of the term without much of the substance is widespread. I do think that the people I just mentioned, in particular Boasberg and Denver,
Okay.
really have the idea, and there are elements of it adapting to local circumstances, even in places like Baltimore, which has a terrible charter law, isn't doing a lot of use of it. But I think the frame of a transformation of the district into an organization that provides schools any way it can, rather than using only one model of provision and trying to create a level playing field, I think those are metaphors, they're images, people are moving toward them.
Okay, other Paul.
Yeah, one of the real signals of whether you're moving to a portfolio approach could be charter schools. That's the obvious signal. But a less obvious signal is student-based budgeting, where money follows the child and where principals really determine how expenditures of dollars take place. Because when principals do that, they're behaving as a charter school. So if you look at places where student-based budgeting is taking place, you're going to see what I would call real portfolio-based, and that is happening in Oakland, it's happening in Baltimore, it's happening in Denver, and there are a handful of other places. Louisiana is exploring that on a statewide basis. I think the more we see student-based budgeting, money follow the child, principals determine how to spend the money, districts become far less important and far less dollars go into district and more into school. That will drive this portfolio approach eventually.
So I'm going to you, John, and then you can add whatever you want to. But the empowering principals as an idea is central to a number of the reforms that are not only on this panel but throughout the day. You've spent a fair amount of your professional life trying to build new style principals who presumably want to be empowered and are ready to be empowered, but who then for the most part have gone to work in school districts that I'm not sure have empowered them. What is and there's a pushback against empowering principals, which is people saying 100,000 school principals in America, how many of them are either fit or competent or eager to be empowered with decision making over things like budget and personnel and curriculum and important things like that? So would you talk a little bit about principal empowerment, especially as you lived it at New Leaders, and then whatever else was on your mind?
Yeah. So I think that we've seen this argues to me for another criteria around picking a places where there's not only a high level of leadership capacity at the school system level, where there's a fair amount of capacity at the educator level in the education system. Because we've certainly seen, we have 700 leaders around the country that we've had work in 12 different school systems and 70 different charter schools. And I've seen efforts to empower leaders where you have leaders who are not ready to do that, and it doesn't work. And in many cities that I've seen around the country, in many communities, if you really had a dramatic empowerment today, as much of an advocate as I am for empowering good leaders, you actually wouldn't see big improvement, and that's true at the school level and the school system level. So I think that actually a criteria would be, I think where there's actually been efforts for some period of time to actually create capacity, so you've got more capacity to use authority is really important. The other thing I would say is, again, where I think there's no one size fits all, and I think there's any magic bullet is suspect, because when we look at our new leaders, we've selected 6% of the 12,000 applicants that applied. And we've studied carefully the difference between a lot of those who've achieved really breakthrough achievement gains and people who've achieved incremental gains but not great. And we have a wide variation within our 6% that we've selected. And I think that any system that didn't differentiate its ability to be able to actually give more authority to a high-capacity leader and more interventions for low-capacity leader would be making a mistake. So to me, one implication is I'm not a fan of saying every school ought to be a charter school. I am a fan of saying where there's good leadership and capacity, you ought to really empower and people to lead in ways that charters can get configured, but have interventions where there's not. So I think it's a bit of a mix and match. The other thing I was going to say, just in terms of places, two interesting places that I would put for your prior question on where might be interesting spots for governance reform soon. One is Memphis, Tennessee. And as some
With
people
this
know,
merger that's going on?
there's a merger
Yeah.
that's going on between the city and the county school system in a state context where there's bipartisan support for a reform agenda. There's going to be a new school board, consolidated school board in Memphis elected in August with a mayor that's very supportive of reform. I think the conditions in some ways in Memphis very interesting for trying out some governance. The other place that I just have to flag, as unlikely as it may seem, just given this yesterday's tentative agreement in Los Angeles, a really remarkable contract it's been tentatively agreed to, hasn't been finally agreed to, which will give individual schools across the system of LA, remarkable power at the school level to make decisions that had once been governed at the system level and by the contract. I think there's a real opportunity for governance reform there too.
1 second, can you say another word about LA? Because all I saw was an LA Times article and about this. I couldn't make out, for example, whether this would instantly go to every school in the system or only schools that want it. And
The latter.
The latter.
The latter. It's my understanding is, now I've seen the summary, I haven't read the whole thing, but my understanding is this is a little bit like the principle in Chicago that's being applied to extended day programs where schools are opting into that and it's not being mandated. Now, this is not just extended day. This is about hiring practices and tenure. But my understanding is an opt-in basis with a vote of the teachers of the school.
And the interesting wrinkle there, at least what I read, was that this is being bargained into the contract by the union, the celebrated Unified Teachers of Los Angeles Union, and the superintendent.
John Dacey has been working at this for months, and this is, it's got huge risk but incredible potential to empower educators at the school level to make decisions that the union would not and the system would never be able to come to at a centralized level.
Go ahead, Ken.
I actually think there's a whole lot more principals out there capable of leading based on the ones I interact with in Texas. But you have to understand, we've had an accountability system since 1985, and test scores are widely known, and so you know what the principal's performance is widely known. You know what the previous principal made in that position, and so there's a pretty competitive market to pay for talent and a pretty good way of recognizing it. And if you look at the sort of hiring war right now on between the Houston Independent School District and KIPP for administrators, you understand that it works across sectors too. And so I actually think there's probably potentially a whole lot of people out there if given the opportunity.
Just to be clear, I think there are a lot of people out there who could be high performers with more latitude. I think New Orleans is an example of that, where the empowerment that New Orleans schools have had leaders who have been longstanding principals in New Orleans who had not gotten great results before, who with that authority have been able to get great results. So to be clear, I think there are a lot of people out there who can do this. That said, I think the variation is still huge, and if you look at one sort of data point, you look at some of the high-performing charter organizations that have actually, now a lot of charters haven't done well, but some of the nonprofit management organizations running charters have gotten some spectacular results as really R&D, essentially an R&D for kind of system as opposed to kind of a school. In some of those places, I will tell you, when you look at their practices, the level of autonomy for the actual principals in those schools is highly variable. And it's not because those principals aren't all like competent. It's not like they should all be fired at all. I mean, these are hardworking, decent people. But the level of somebody who's able to really drive really strong results for somebody who's not, there's variability there, and some of these high-performing charter systems do differentiate, even within a charter context.
Joel Klein tried pretty hard for several years to empower as many principals as were willing to take it in New York City, as I recall. Anybody up here know how many he got up to within the New York City system of sort of principals volunteering for this additional empowerment?
Well, actually, he got them all.
I don't think so.
What he ended up, my understanding is, the original theory was the empowerment zone.
Yeah.
And you volunteered. And in year 2, that ramped up dramatically from 100 to 300. But then he told everybody, you're on your own. And everybody became a part of that, my understanding.
Does anybody know
That's
more?
my understanding too now, that there may be principals that are trying to duck the responsibility, but they actually do have the money and they have a lot greater authority over hiring and the like than they did before.
Yeah.
And that's universal.
And so what's happened, and really we mimic, this is a lot of what we're mimicking in Louisiana, and it's an interesting question, Jon has raised, and Deasy has raised in Los Angeles. Do you wait for those who are willing to take it, or do you just simply impose it on everyone? And I would argue that if we wait for everybody to take it, a lot of kids are going to die. and our economy is going to sputter. So why not get with the program, give the people the responsibility, give them very specific standards, tell them they're empowered, and if they don't deliver, get rid of them and find somebody else. And oh, by the way, pay them. Now, in New Orleans, we have principals who are making $250,000. But they're not just running one school anymore. Here's another idea. What if principals ran multiple schools? Let's take the best principals and give them more than one school. There's a novel idea. We don't do that anywhere in this country that I know of, except in the charter communities. But what we're doing in New Orleans is, if you don't run a good school, you're out of business. If you do run a good school, hey, would you like to take the one that just went out of business?
So we talk about governance, but governance and human resources are totally linked. And governance is a constraint on human resources and vice versa. But almost any theory of greater competition, empowerment, level playing field, parent choice involves the idea that you can, over time, not instantly, attract a different level of people into jobs like the principalship. Louisiana is a perfect example of that. Not only did they take advantage of people that were there, they got people from all over the world. One thing I think Michelle Rhee accomplished here was she changed the direction of the brain drain from D.C. to Montgomery County the other way, and brought people of very high ability back into the system. That's possible when you can say you have a lot more authority than you had before, and you actually have a chance to succeed. And that I think is where governance can improve your human resource problem instead of make it worse.
It's one thing I want to clarify that I think is really important sort of distinction in terms of principal and school autonomy is to distinguish on staffing autonomy and budget autonomy from curriculum autonomy.
Okay.
I believe we've seen that I think I would say that having principals broadly, as long as there is a talent strategy, which there was in New York, there was in D.C., there was in New Orleans, you've got to have a strategy actually for bringing in talent and developing current talent, which is crucial. But as long as you do, both from developing talent in the system and bringing it from the outside, I think having principals get latitude and autonomy over staffing and budget is consistent with what we see good schools doing, which is leaders are empowered to make decisions and work with their teachers to do it. The distinction I guess I'm making in terms of the differential autonomy is on curriculum. And I think that there's a difference between empowering all principals in the system with budget and staffing authority as opposed to curricular authority. I think a lot of the high-performing systems are seeing that there actually is a benefit for empowering staffing and budget, but actually having more consistency in curriculum while letting your highest capacity and principals be able to innovate in curriculum in ways that you might not have the whole system of schools do, whether that's a district or a charter system.
I suspect we're all taking for granted that there would continue to be something resembling at least statewide academic standards and assessments and accountability arrangements. So, and perhaps multi-state or even national. Wash out my mouth. And then we would get into the complicated distinction where do standards leave off and curriculum begins, about which we could have a 4-day symposium and reach no consensus at all, I fear. But thank you, the distinction's important. As we near the end of a long day, I want to give everybody sitting out there another opportunity to get into the act. We've got about 17 minutes left by my watch, and we'd welcome some questions from the floor for members of the panel. It's practically impossible for me to see into the spotlights, so those with mics are going to pick the questioners.
Yeah,
and you've got to identify yourself.
My name is Li Yang. I guess we are.
You are what?
Li Yang is my name.
And do you have
I'm an independent TV producer.
Okay.
And I suppose this program is extension from K to 12 to the real world. And my question is, what kind of specific action or analysis that you take or you are aware of in order to improve the students' moral value, and then distinguish the real productivity to the society rather than profit over people. And the bailout Wall Street or occupation movement.
Okay.
And I just wonder what kind of action that you take to improve the real society value and just maybe including the lawyers. You know, a lot of people seeing the problem of three branches and lawyers. If we can
All
make
right,
an
all
improvement,
right.
that would be good.
You placed much too tall an order upon this panel, which is to improve society, not just schools. And we set out to improve schools
I
and
think
the
that
public education system. So Paul, take it away.
Thomas More had it right. Kill all the lawyers.
Kill all the lawyers.
Except for one.
I thought that was actually a Shakespeare line.
It might have been.
But regardless,
I would say, to follow on to that, I don't think we do any of that. I think we stay away from that. I think if we educate kids well, kids behave and grow up and learn and to become productive members of society. But I am of the opinion, and I could, just one opinion, but in Louisiana, there is no driver of public policy that tries to regulate that except an old law that somebody tried to pass to make that happen with character education, and we really don't pay much attention to it.
I would just add that I think that Paul is right to have some, humility about what the state or the federal government could do to drive that in schools in a comprehensive way. But I will say that when you look at the individual school level, and we've analyzed the schools have gotten the biggest successes and gains, there is no question that a central factor is the way the schools build cultures in the school of high expectation that really do cultivate some very specifically kind of what you might call basic core American values at the school level, and the culture reinforces that in every way. It is not a character education program where kids spend like an hour a week on it. It is not just some posters on the wall, but it's the way that the school operates, and I haven't seen a truly successful school that hasn't done that. The question of how you drive it in a more sort of a way at scale, I mean, I'm a little biased on this too, but the only thing I can see in the end, the biggest driver that I've seen is a principal. And so I think that actually a strategy which is really selecting, developing outstanding principals who are empowered to do that is one way of accomplishing that important goal.
thank you. Yes, on the end, in the third row, bring her a mic. I can see you.
Thank you. Hi, Andrew Klein with the Family Voices of DC. With regard to Louisiana and the changes brought about with regard to educational achievement and governance, is there a strategic plan in place going over several number of years with regard to the continuum and also the partnerships developed to enhance and ensure the achievements?
Anybody got to take a whack at that one?
So there certainly is an effort to sustain the model of education that they built in New Orleans and to enrich it by continually improving the schools, but also by improving the support infrastructure for schools. There's a group called New Schools for New Orleans that is developing a whole set of the kinds of organizations schools need support from, but may not want to get it from a central office so that schools are able to buy those things. That's enriching the soup there. Is that responsive?
Bring her the mic again, because I didn't understand the question myself, and somebody else was speaking into my other ear.
I guess I'm coming from the standpoint of a business development person in nonprofit America. If we're going to be making change, part of that comes with a strategic plan. So for me, a strategic plan is the short term to the long term. With the changes made, let's say New Orleans. Okay, so you've made the progress that you've made. It looks like you're opting more towards charter schools. What's next? You know, what is the big plan? Do you have a solid strategic plan so that if we're looking at areas in the other parts of the country that are beginning from scratch, instead of remaking the wheel, taking what you have, but making it apropos to that specific culture?
Well, I don't want to sound, like I'm not being serious about this, but the strategic plan in Louisiana is to build world-class education for all of our kids. And there are a number of strategies that we have outlined to be able to do that. And it calls for a certain coherence. It calls for different responsibilities to be executed by the state. I could spend a whole lot of time about talking about state governance and its role. One of the biggest parts of that strategic plan, though, as it relates to New Orleans, is the state has to have a capacity building mechanism to be able to assure that what happens in New Orleans does in fact continually improve. So on the one hand, we're not going to run the schools, but on the other hand, we need to know what will make good schools run. And we need to be able to know it when we see it, to be able to call it out, and to be able to call for an end to it when we don't see it. So it's, now, in terms of how do you take New Orleans and what is the future plan, I would just say this. While I say that we're going to move to all charter schools is not the issue. It is about having principals drive change in the buildings and being responsible and having all the tools at their disposal to be able to do that. It so happens that it's easier to make that work when you have a charter in place. So, but I would argue that the long-term strategic plan in New Orleans is put bad schools out of business, set clear expectations on what good schools will do, put reasonable growth targets in place, and be aggressive, not just on the low-end schools, but on all of the schools in the district.
Thank you, Paul. Is there another question? Out here. Somebody way back near the coffee pot.
Hi, I'm Camille Anderson. I'm with the D.C. State Board of Education. But my question, particularly for the case of New Orleans, and I guess otherwise, but is the idea of decentralizing school administrations completely dead out of the water? Have we just leapfrogged from the traditional school administration model to charters? Is there no way in which, and I hear something about principal empowerment and autonomy, which I'm assuming is somewhere along that line with decentralization, but is that idea completely out of the water, specifically with New Orleans or elsewhere?
When you say decentralization, you mean in sub-districts or regions within a district?
I'm speaking more about basically the principal empowerment idea,
Okay.
where the schools basically, the principal becomes a leader of the school, the CEO of the school, and he runs it with the budget authority and,
Okay.
hiring, firing decisions.
I think we've talked about that some, but if anybody would like to amplify
But it seems to me, we did talk about it, but I'm just saying in New Orleans, it doesn't seem as if that was even something on the scale of consideration.
Well, it's because I then didn't communicate very well. Decentralization of the district leadership is part and parcel of the strategy. The district is highly decentralized. It's part of what makes it complex. And one of the big questions is, are there any central functions for the district? Because we've tried to abandon as many functions in the district as we can, which has, and chartering and principal autonomy has led to that decentralization. But it is very much a part of it. There is a district office. It's very small and it's very decent, and its control is not strong.
I would just add that there are different cities and states that have tried out kind of school-level decentralization strategies with different outcomes. And I'd say, to me, the lessons are, one, there's got to be not only a school-level authority, but accountability for performance. And two, is there's got to be a focus on development of talent. I'd look at a place in the mid-'90s. My view, the mayor got control of the school system. But there was a decentralization in the Chicago schools to the local school councils, which have been running individual schools, which has produced some very mediocre results system-wide. And I think that type of school-level authority there hasn't driven big results, in part because it wasn't coupled with accountability, in part because there was some confused governance between the elected boards and the principals, and in part because there wasn't a talent development strategy. So I'm a big believer in that, but I think the how is important as whether you do that. And I think the accountability and the talent development and the clarity and concentration of decision-making in one place, not multiple, are all elements of a strategy to make that work.
Yeah, and just real quick, I would argue that the district role in this, in fact, I call it the 21st century school district, its role is threefold. One is to set goals and standards and hold people accountable. Number two is to allow for a highly competitive, to support and endorse a highly competitive environment. And number three is to provide capacity where capacity isn't otherwise available from third parties, to provide capacity to assist schools in being able to be successful. So generally what that means is the district office becomes almost purely an accountability function, as opposed to hiring for staff in the school building, reviewing staff, all of that stuff goes by the board.
Is there a last question before we turn to Cindy Brown? Way back near the coffee pot, the last question. Hurry, hurry, hurry.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Coco. I'm an education attorney here in DC, and I have a question about, the RSD as a governance model. And the way you're describing it, it sounds like it's an effective strategy for taking over low-performing schools. So I'm wondering if it's sort of a triage model for fixing schools, is it something that you would recommend is permanent? Would you say that the state should permanently have control of these schools, or is there a model for turning them back over to some sort of local school board?
That's a very interesting question. I don't think the state should keep the schools forever, but I don't think the schools should be given back to the district until the district demonstrates the wherewithal and capacity to be able to take the schools. So what we've done in Louisiana is we've said, if the schools are doing well, then they can decide to go back to the local school district whenever they want. So it's up to the school. If the school is not doing well by the recovery school district's oversight, the district may petition for the school back, and it must compete against any proposal for the operation of the school. So I would argue that it's there as a fixer-upper. It's not there on a permanent basis, but if people like what they've got and they're doing well, then they should be allowed to stay, if that makes sense.
And if you put a fixed time limit on it, then people would just wait it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. How about a round of thanks for this panel? The panel is dismissed, and the afternoon will be closed out by our friend and colleague from the Center for American Progress, Cindy Brown.
Wow, this has been quite a day, and I'm really glad that so many of you have stayed with us for the entire session. This all got started when Checker heard me someplace ranting about governance, and he tapped me on the back. I think we were over at AEI of all places, and he said, "I got a proposition for you I want to talk to you about." And he'd been thinking about Fordham taking on this governance issue, and I immediately said, "We're in." Now, I do have a few bosses back at the Center for American Progress, and I want to assure you that I went back and talked with them about whether we would embark on what's, in the immediate future, a 3-year initiative of Fordham and the Center for American Progress. But we're not so naive to believe that we'll get these ideas fully explored, or even recommendations for fully changing things. And our goal is to keep this on the agenda for a number of years till we see some changes, with the ultimate goal of improve student performance by all the kids in this country, including closing achievement gaps. So I think we got a good start. As our New Zealand friends told us, governance can be sexy. And we will keep trying to make it that way. I will tell you, I learned something totally new today about Checker after I made my own remarks about the Nixon Commission report, Commission on School Finance. He told me he worked in the Nixon White House and actually worked on that commission. So maybe that 140-page document with the ideas I said eerily track some of what we talk about today had their origins with Checker back then. Again, I urge you, if you want to read it, I actually have an online version, which I think Congressman Shaka Fatah got GAO or some part of the U.S. government that probably scan and make it available through the internet. So I do have it, though, so it's possible if you want to read it. So we really covered, I think we raised a lot of key issues pretty deeply today, and hopefully this will move this whole idea of governance of public education higher on the reform agenda. I had written policy agenda. I crossed that out. This isn't about policy. As Checker said this morning, we're trying to move beyond policy into structure, the structure of governance, and to look at the governance system in a comprehensive way. And I think we've done a great job today of shining a light on the challenges to our system, or perhaps more accurately, something closer to a non-system, given the fragmentation of what we have before us. We've explored some areas of change, including various kinds of choice options, whether it's charters or virtual schools, looked at teacher preparation. I do think, having listened to everything today, that we actually have the beginnings of a consensus. Now, whether it goes beyond this room is another matter, which I'll get to in a moment. I think there's kind of a consensus that we need to at least have state responsibility for financing with weighted student funding and student-based funding, money following a kid. We need to have a constrained role of school districts. We need much more empowered leaders at the school level, which I'm sure Paul Pastorek would probably agree is not only principals but teacher leaders and working very collaboratively in schools. And then we need an accountability system which triggers action, and that system is located both at the district and state level. We talk about accountability at the federal level, but whether that's more, we put it into laws, we have rhetoric, but the Fed's taking over states ain't going to happen. We really have gotten off to a great start today. But where do we go from here? And I think that's where we still have a lot more work to do. Paul Hill laid out an option, but he really didn't tell us. He said some districts are moving this way, but we don't, and we hear references to states that might be good candidates for changing the way that they do business, but I don't think anybody's set out yet the steps this will take. Obviously, in some places, people are feeling their way towards a different and a better system, but we need to think more deeply about what the steps might be to move in these directions that, if I'm right, and maybe I'm not, that there seems to be some sort of consensus around. I mean, it was interesting to hear Paul Pastorek talk about the origins of the reforms in New Orleans, and he said they actually started with a state law before the hurricane, but it took the hurricane to make that dramatic change actually happen. And, we don't want to have to rely on horrible events like that where people die. We ought to be able to have a more civilized, sensible way to institute change. And I'm not sure what that is. And I think if we have another gathering or something, more events and public discussions of these issues, we hopefully can look at some of that. I do think we heard throughout the day that what we really need are courageous leaders. But I would say we need groups of courageous leaders. I was sad when Paul Pastorek left the state superintendency of Louisiana. And I worry about what's going to happen with him not there. Although he assures people that they're good leaders that he's left behind. But we really need a group of very visible, courageous leaders at the state level, at some big city district levels. So we can't just rely on the one person. We've seen too much of that. And we have to somehow help our leaders find partners that will continue on these efforts over time. And I'm not quite sure, I don't know if we've had enough discussion about the need for that. I think we all agree we want change to be more than just incremental. And maybe that's Checker and me, because we've been at this quite a while. And so we've become more radical and more impatient, but we've just got to move at a faster pace because we see other countries doing it. And the other thing that a lot of Americans don't realize is that these countries that have changed, South Korea, Singapore, Finland, they did these major changes in 20, 30 years. It's not impossible to make significant change. For us, it would be significant change in a collection of states. Obviously those countries are not the size of the US. And then the one issue that really didn't come up today that I think we need to think more about is this country's going through a tremendous demographic change. We are going to be, I'm sure this isn't the language we'll be using then, but by 2050 we'll be a majority-minority country. We'll have a different way of saying that. We're going to be a majority country of people of color, whatever the language is. When you've been at this as long as I have, you learn that the language changes constantly, and that's good. That's good. I'm not complaining. But the population is growing among those students and families who have not been well served by the public education system that we have. And the question is how we're going to work with the leaders of those communities to try to change things to tackle these governance questions. Because what we're most concerned about is that we haven't made much change in student achievement. And we still have these huge achievement gaps. So I think it's important that we think about demographic changes, the groups and leaders that represent these growing groups, and how we can get them into these conversations and into gatherings like that. And so with that, let me just end by a couple of things. One, I want to thank the Fordham and CAP staff who have helped put all this conference together. Believe me, it wasn't Checker and me alone. And I really want to thank them for making this go so well and so smoothly, and to thank the editors of our book, which is going to be terrific, and we're really excited to see it when it comes out. Paul and Pat, it's been great. I also want to thank the funders that have made this this project, this initiative possible, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Lynn and Harry Bradley Foundation, the Fisher Fund, and the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation. We also want to thank the hotel, the Hilton Hotel. They've made this a very nice gathering today. And I want to remind you all that the papers are online. We may be out of hard copies, I'm not sure. And now, the most important thing, there's a reception in the room where we had lunch. And so we can continue our conversation today informally. So thank you again for coming. I hope you agree this has been a very successful day. Thanks.